All right, we come now to utilitarianism, and that's the name both of the book and of the theory. Now, the reason I have all these pictures of unfortunate looking British dudes on the blackboard is that utilitarianism, unlike Kant's ethical theory, is a genuine tradition and school of thought. So Kant was a guy who just like hung out on his own. He taught like all but two topics at his university. Like he was the professor for all but two departments and like the lone professor. And he just stayed to himself. He only left the town he was born in and lived in like a handful of times in his life. He was famous for doing the exact same thing every day at the same time. Apparently, women would set their clocks by when Immanuel Kant took a walk. He was an incredibly regimented, incredibly isolated guy. And the city he lived in, Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, was at the time a pretty small town, not the center of German intellectual life. Now, the way it ended up going was that Kant's work became famous in his own lifetime. And he had a tremendous influence on Germany, on German thought. And then pretty quickly on philosophical thought throughout the Western world. But it didn't come in the form of particular students of his carrying on his tradition, nor was he connected in any significant way to earlier thinkers, right? So it's not like he's the student of some other great thinker. He had read widely, he knew of, and he knew to some extent personally some of the other major figures of German philosophy at the time, but he was off on his own. He wasn't part of a group. Utilitarians were a group. Now, they weren't always called that. They didn't start being called that until the guy whose book we're reading, John Stuart Mill, started calling them that. But there's an identifiable group going back at least as far as Jeremy Bentham. He's the guy all the way on the left. If you look up Jeremy Bentham online, you're going to see a disgusting image of his preserved head because after he died, he gave his body to, I believe, University College London, but he gave it to some school in London and just said, hey, keep it there. And so, he died in 1832. So his body's been there a while. And I guess for a while, the seniors would like do a prank of stealing parts of his body. I don't understand. But Jeremy Bentham was a philosopher and a social reformer. And that's one of the, another thing that sets the utilitarians apart from Kant. Kant was a university professor. Kant spent his whole life as a university professor. It was his only job. Jeremy Bentham never taught in university. James Mill never taught in university. And John Stuart Mill never taught in university. Henry Sidgwick was a university professor. But he's one of the later utilitarians. And as you can see, he lived much later than some of the other ones. He was born after Jeremy Bentham died. Now, Bentham didn't come up with utilitarianism out of nowhere. But most people agree that there is a pretty significant break with the past. So he was developing the thought of previous authors, but he developed it into a very bold, very simple theory. And so he's often treated as the founder of utilitarianism, even though he never called it that. Jeremy Bentham was close friends with James Mill. Now, the other thing to realize about these guys, besides the fact that they were not primarily academics and were primarily social reformers, is that they weren't just working in ethics. In fact, nobody we read in this course just worked in ethics. Kant was the closest to someone who just worked in philosophy. He taught a lot, but he doesn't have a lot of publications elsewhere. He did help come up with the theory of the formation of the solar system that we currently have. It's called sometimes the Kant-Laplace theory of the solar system formation. But it's not like he spent equal time on non-philosophical pursuits as philosophical pursuits. The way Aristotle did and the way Plato sort of did, although like philosophy as an independent field didn't really exist back then. But the utilitarians, especially the early utilitarians, spent just as much time on stuff that wasn't ethics. James Mill was one of the early founders of the associationist school of psychology in England. Jeremy Bentham focused most of his efforts on actually writing laws, especially in the area of criminal justice reform. So they're working together, Jeremy Bentham and James Mill. And as a result, James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, has Jeremy Bentham as his godfather, despite the fact that neither Jeremy Bentham nor James Mill believe in God. But Jeremy Bentham and James Mill are working together. And among their other pursuits, which were generally speaking to make the United Kingdom more democratic and have more protection of individual liberties, among their other projects, they developed this ethical theory. And I'm going to tell you about the ethical theory, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about John Stuart Mill's reaction to the ethical theory, because there's a big dividing line in the history of utilitarianism right here between Jeremy Bentham and James Mill on one side and John Stuart Mill and Henry Sidgwick on the other. Now, this is not something that John Stuart Mill admitted. When you read this book, you're going to see all the time him saying, well, utilitarians think this, and utilitarians think that. And usually what he means is that he thinks that. And what he doesn't usually acknowledge is that his father and his godfather, who were the two leaders of the utilitarian movement before Mill, didn't really believe it. Right? John Stuart Mill does not admit, and maybe to some extent didn't even realize, it's not always clear, but he certainly did not admit in this book that he was making significant changes to utilitarian doctrine, but he was. So I'm going to tell you about classical utilitarianism, which is the view that Jeremy Bentham and James Mill had. And then when you read the book, you're going to be exposed to the sort of updated, more modern version of utilitarianism developed by John Stuart Mill. Now, even though it's modern, utilitarianism has changed since then. There are still utilitarians, the way there are still Platonists, Aristotelians, and Kantians in ethics. And nobody, well, not many people anyway, follow John Stuart Mill all the way down the line. Not many people think he was right about everything. So there are versions of utilitarianism that are different than John Stuart Mill's. But everyone recognizes that of the early utilitarians, of the people I have here on the blackboard, his was the most innovative and well-developed version. Henry Sidgwick wrote a very important book in the history of ethics. It touched on more topics than John Stuart Mill's did, but a lot of the most important theoretical innovations come from John Stuart Mill, which is why we're going to be spending our time on him and not any of the earlier people. Okay, so let's talk about Jeremy Bentham and James Mill. And not talk about them in particular, but let's talk about classical utilitarianism. This is the view that they helped to develop, and it's the view that James Mill taught to his son. I have a little bit to say about that before this video is over, about John Stuart Mill's education. All right, classical utilitarianism, like I said, is a bold and simple ethical theory. Now, you can understand classical utilitarianism as consisting of two principles. Principle one, the right action is the one which maximizes good consequences. Right? So whenever you're considering doing something, you can tell which of the actions that are available to you. Like you've got options, right? There's different things you can do. You can tell which one of those is the right one to do in that situation by thinking about the consequences of performing each of them. And you take the consequences of performing each of them and you compare them to each other. You compare them to each other based on how good the results will be. Whichever one has the best consequences, that's the right action. Now you might think best consequences for who? Well, for everyone. Right? The best consequences, for all. Okay, then you might ask, well, right, what makes consequences good? Well, then we get to principle two, which is just hedonism. Right? So we're going all the way back to Plato now. Remember Plato in the Protagoras, or Plato in the Protagoras has Socrates say that pleasure is the good. Right? What makes things good is pleasure. What makes things bad is pain. Well, that's what the utilitarians think. right? Ever since the Protagoras, we've seen different ways of denying that pleasure is the good. All of Plato's work after that seems to deny that pleasure is the good. Aristotle denies that pleasure is the whole of the good. He thinks pleasure can be good when it's pleasure taken in good and noble things. But pleasure is not in itself good, right? Or unconditionally good, rather. And it is not good. It's not the entirety of the good. Kant seems to deny that pleasure is good at all. Right? Or certainly it's not unconditionally good. But the classical utilitarians think, no, pleasure's not only always good, it's not only unconditionally good, it's the only thing that's good. Anything else that's good is good because it gives you pleasure or gives somebody pleasure. Right? So it's not just you. And that's it. That's the whole moral theory. Right? Once you accept those two principles, then making moral decisions is just a matter of what came to be known as the hedonic calculus. So all you have to do is figure out what the likely results of your actions are. And that's not really a job for ethics, right? That's a job for, if it's normal everyday actions, like should I order pizza or should I make my own food? You can rely on yourself to figure out the consequences of your own like small time actions. For big time actions, it's a job for social science, right? If you want to know whether passing a law is the right thing or voting for that law is the right thing to do. If you want to know whether quarantine during coronavirus is the right thing to do, and if so, how long, what you do is you consult the experts. If you're asking about the quarantine, you're supposed to be talking to social scientists like economists. You're supposed to be talking to public health experts, things like that. The ethical theory doesn't tell you what the consequences of particular actions are. That's not what ethics does. What ethics tells you is that the consequences are all that matters. And notice here how different this is than Kant, and how different it also is from Plato and Aristotle. Right? Plato and Aristotle think that what makes an action right is the character, to the extent they care about right action at all, they care about which actions are the ones that a virtuous person would do. So they care about the character that the person performing them has. Or maybe a better way to think about it is they want to know whether a person with a good character would do this kind of thing, whatever kind of thing you're interested in, whatever action you're asking the question of. All right. They want to know whether, to figure out whether an action is good, whether a person with a good character would do that action in those circumstances. Kant thinks whether an action is right is just a matter of intention, just a matter of your maxim, right? The principle you were acting on. So for Plato, Aristotle, and Kant, if you want to determine the moral status of an action, you have to look at something about the mindset of the person performing it. Right? What is their character like? What were their maxims? Things like that. Now, there are disagreements there, but they agree fundamentally that the moral status of action depends in some way on the moral status of mental features of the agent performing the action. And the classical utilitarians just say, nope, whether an action is right is determined entirely by what it leads to. So when you're trying to figure out which action to perform, all you should care about is what will result from it. It's harder to get a clearer contrast between ethical theories than the contrast between Kant and the classical utilitarians. Kant and Bentham are not quite the same age. Kant's a little older. Bentham lives forever and a day, so that's part of the reason. Like Kant died in the early 1800s. Jeremy Bentham made it another 25 years after Kant. But they're roughly living at the same time. And they've got these two very different ethical theories. And of course, this theory of the good, right? Of course, theory of good doesn't really matter to Kant in the first place. Or to the extent that he has a theory of good, it's just that a good will is what's good. Whereas for Bentham, it's hedonism. This view that has been attacked throughout the history of ethics, right? The only time any major ethicist held it was way back thousands of years ago in ancient Greece. And even then, Plato wrote a dialogue in favor of it, but it's not really clear Plato believed it. And the other kinds of hedonism, which I discussed earlier, when we were talking about Plato, which said, well, the best way to be a hedonist is just to desire less and less. This is not the kind of hedonism Jeremy Bentham has in mind. Right? Jeremy Bentham is like, pleasure is just a feeling you get when you do certain things. Right? Like, you got an itch, you scratch it, that feels nice. Pleasure. Right? He does not have this view that what you ought to do is restrict your desires to make them easier to fulfill so that you experience more pleasure. This is not what's going on here. This is, there's certain feelings that you feel. That's what makes life good, when you feel certain of them. What makes life bad is when you feel different ones, right? That's pleasure and pain. And that's all there is to it. What you figure out is which action that you can perform will lead to the most pleasure and the least pain for everyone in the world. Like everyone, everyone impacted by your action. And that's it. That's the whole story. It is way simpler than Plato or Aristotle's view. It's way, way, way simpler than Kant's view. And you might think, well, that's nice, because I'm done, right? There's a little more you can say about classical utilitarianism, but this is basically it. And you might think, oh, that's great, we're done now. But here's the problem. The simpler an ethical view is, the more likely it is to get answers that just strike us as really, really, really wrong about what you should do. And we'll discuss a little bit about that when we get to Mill's actual book. But this is the theory that Mill was taught. This is the theory that Mill inherited. When Mill took over effective leadership of the utilitarian tradition, of the utilitarian political and social action groups, right? He was taking over a theory like this. And what he's going to do is he's going to make significant amendments to both 1 and 2. So much so that it's not really clear that Mill's defending this theory, right? Because anytime, you have two people who say they believe the same thing, they actually probably believe slightly different versions of that thing. So when you say that Bentham and James Mill, John Stuart Mill's dad, both were classical utilitarians, there were probably differences between them. In fact, we know there were differences between them on one really central issue at the time, which was women's rights, where James Mill was basically against women's rights, against the vote for women, and Jeremy Bentham was in favor of votes for women. Now, that isn't so much a difference in their ethical theory. It's basically a difference in how rational they were. Jeremy Bentham realized that his ethical theory implied that women ought to have the vote, and James Mill, who was just a little more stuck in his ways, conservative, just refused to admit that. John Stuart Mill would later take his father to task for this. John Stuart Mill, who was a very early male feminist, sometimes is called the first feminist, which is the dumbest thing in the world. I'm pretty sure there were women who wanted greater representation in society and in politics and all that kind of stuff before John Stuart Mill came along. But for men, he's pretty early. So the point here is there can be minor differences between people on when it comes to ethics, but they still have the same basic theory. It's not clear when you make the transition from these two guys, right, to John Stuart Mill that you even have the same theory. There are certain similarities. John Stuart Mill is going to maintain the belief that it's the consequences of action somehow that settle their moral status. He's going to maintain that pleasure plays a big role in the good. But he's going to change both the components of this view. All right, so I want to tell you a little bit about John Stuart Mill and his life before we finish up this video, and then we'll get right into the book. All right, so John Stuart Mill is born in 1806. Jeremy Bentham and James Mill are basically in charge of his education, especially his dad, James Mill. Jeremy Bentham's involved, but he's a godfather. He's not most involved. And James Mill decided to make his son a little bit of an experiment. And I don't mean he made an experiment for his son. I mean, he decided to test out his theories on psychology by how he raised his son. And the early results were very encouraging. John Stuart Mill could speak French and English by the time he was 3, apparently. He could speak and read Latin and Greek by the time he was 8. By the time he was, I think, 11, he was editing his father's books. So James Mill was a psychologist, he was an ethicist, he was an economist, he was a legal theorist, and he was writing these books, and John Stuart Mill was his editor. Like he was going through and checking the grammar. He was going through and evaluating the arguments. John Stuart Mill began writing for public consumption in his early teen years, meaning like he was submitting articles to journals that adults typically wrote for when he was 14. John Stuart Mill had basically mastered every discipline you could learn at university before he was old enough to go to university. And everything was looking great, right? John Stuart Mill was all ready to take on the mantle of his godfather and his father. Right? So by the time he's 20, they're both still alive. It's like 1826. Jerry Bentham's old. I mean, he'd been old for a while at that point. And his father is, no spring chicken, but they're still around and they get to look on him and say, like, this is going great. And then around the time he's 20, John Stuart Mill has a complete and total nervous breakdown because he's been worked every day of his life. He's been forced at like age 4 and 5 to be learning Latin and Greek, to learn all the most advanced science and math of his day when he was like 8 or 9. John Stuart Mill says he never had friends when he was a kid. Like he didn't play ever. James Mill thought, well, with the right discipline and with the right control over the influences on someone, you can basically make a perfect human being. And for a while, I'm sure James Mill thought, this is working, right? John Stuart Mill was excelling in every way it was possible for someone to excel. But according to John Stuart Mill, the cost of this was like John Stuart Mill never read poetry because James Mill thought, well, what does poetry teach you? Right? Better to learn some more economics. John Stuart Mill never had friends. Like I said, he never had playtime. Like he never just had free time where he did stuff. He never read poetry, he never listened to music, right? And all these things built up until in his late teens, early 20s, he had a complete breakdown and he was unable to work. He was unable to do anything. The way he describes it, it sounds like just this incredibly deep depressive episode. And he says the only thing that got him out of it was he started doing some of the things his father had never allowed him to do, like read poetry, talk to other people his own age about the things they cared about and not just these abstract technical issues. And this, many people think, John Stuart Mill himself basically tells us, he doesn't come out and explicitly say it, I don't think. John Stuart Mill basically tells us this is when he started breaking away from his father and his godfather. Not hugely, right? He still considered himself as being involved in the same project they were involved in, a project of social reform based on a philosophical theory. And John Stuart Mill would go on not only to be a major philosopher, probably the greatest philosopher in the English-speaking world in the 1800s, but he would be a member of Parliament. He would effectively run India for a while. He had a very, very high position at the East India Company, which basically ruled India in the 1800s. Just to keep in mind, he did some bad stuff while he was effectively running India. But he did become important. He did push a lot of reform causes. And he wrote some of the most famous books of philosophy in the English-speaking language ever. But he did so while having a more critical eye for his father and his godfather's work and their theories than they would have liked. And we know that because they were both still alive when he started writing again after his little breakdown. And they did not like some of the stuff they were seeing. He's going to basically, without admitting it, attack both components of their ethical theory. The theory that everything else they believed in was based on. So all their views about reforming the law, all their views about reforming society, right? All of it was based on this very simple ethical theory. And what John Stuart Mill is going to come and do is say, look, these are wrong. Right? These are not correct. We have to change them. And we have to change them by making them more complicated so that they have a better chance of getting the right answer. Because guess what? The world's complicated. It's not quite so straightforward and simple as you guys want to make it. Right? We're not going to in this class talk about Henry Sidgwick. I just bring him up because he is at least as important as Bentham and Mill and James Mill. I mean, James Mill is honestly the least important guy of these four. But because he comes after John Stuart Mill and because his work touches on a whole lot of other stuff, we're not going to get into him. I'm not even really going to mention him much in the process of going through John Stuart Mill's book. Okay, so that's the context in which John Stuart Mill wrote utilitarianism. But do keep in mind, his sort of personal affection and loyalty for his father and his godfather means that he's never going to come right out and say, Bentham and my father were wrong, and here's how I'm changing it. He's going to represent his defense of utilitarianism as a defense of the original theory, the same theory his father and godfather held. But he's not. He is presenting a much more sophisticated, a much more plausible version of the theory. If utilitarianism had just been left the way Jeremy Bentham and James Mill left it, I'm not sure we'd talk about it anymore. Except as this historical episode where there were these reformers in England and they believed in this like weird theory that everybody with any sense can see as false. But with John Stuart Mill's changes to it, and the fact that having made changes, it now became clear to everyone else, well, it's okay if we make changes too. It has now become one of the major ethical theories out there. It's really, for most people, just between Kant and Mill as to who's got the better theory. But maybe more importantly, outside of philosophy, utilitarianism is, for many people, just the default option. Like when people discuss policy, public policy, and they try to analyze whether public policy is good or bad, they almost always do so with the implicit assumption that utilitarianism is right. That the way you evaluate whether the government enacting some policy was a good idea is to look at the consequences of enacting the policy and the consequences for everyone. And the way that the consequences matter is you see how much people liked or didn't like what happened. And that's basically utilitarianism, as we're going to see. So that's the context for Mill's book, and we'll move on to the very short chapter 1 next.